The cranberry sauce was still warm when my sister-in-law Jessica stood up at our family Thanksgiving table and pointed her perfectly manicured finger directly at me. "We know you've just been spending company money on training courses." She snapped, her voice cutting through the gentle chatter like a blade. "You're terminated." Every conversation stopped. My nephew dropped his fork. My mother gasped. I calmly reached into my purse, pulled out my Morrison Industrial Supply badge, and placed it beside her untouched plate. "You have 15 minutes before your main job," I said quietly, standing to leave. The silence that followed my exit was probably deafening, but I was already in my car driving through the crisp November evening toward my apartment. My hands weren't shaking yet. That would come later. For now, I felt strangely calm, like I was watching someone else's life implode in slow motion. 3 years ago, when my brother David first suggested I apply for the vendor relations position at Morrison Industrial Supply, I thought it would be a simple family favor. His new wife Jessica had recently been promoted to acting CEO after her father temporarily stepped down for health reasons, and they needed someone reliable to manage supplier relationships. I had a business degree and some logistics experience from my previous job at a smaller firm. It seemed perfect. What I discovered was that I had a genuine talent for supply chain management, not just the basic stuff like tracking orders and managing contracts, but the complex strategic thinking that separates good supply chain managers from exceptional ones. I could see patterns others missed, anticipate problems before they became crises, and build relationships that went beyond simple vendor agreements. The training courses Jessica had just mocked me for were actually advanced certifications in international logistics crisis management and vendor relationship strategies. I had earned credentials from the American Production and Inventory Control Society, completed specialized programs in supply chain risk assessment, and even studied disaster recovery protocols used by Fortune 500 companies. Every single course was approved through proper company channels, documented with receipts and directly applicable to my growing responsibilities at Morrison. But Jessica saw them differently. To her, I was David's little sister who had been handed a job out of charity. She never bothered to review my performance metrics, which showed I had reduced vendor costs by 18% while improving delivery reliability by 25%. She didn't care that I had identified and corrected billing discrepancies that saved the company over $60,000 in the past year alone. In her mind, I was playing dress-up in a grown woman's job, and those courses were just expensive toys I was buying with company money. 6 months ago, I had started noticing troubling patterns in our supplier dependencies. Morrison relied too heavily on single-source vendors for critical components, leaving us vulnerable if any of those relationships failed. I spent weeks researching alternative suppliers, building contingency plans, and developing what I privately called my backup network. I presented my findings to Jessica in a detailed report, complete with risk assessments and cost-benefit analyses. She dismissed it in under 5 minutes. "Mary, we've been working with these vendors for decades. They're reliable. Stop trying to fix things that aren't broken." But I couldn't stop seeing the vulnerabilities. So I kept building relationships with secondary suppliers on my own time, attending trade shows, networking with other supply chain managers, and quietly establishing connections that could serve as emergency alternatives. I documented everything in encrypted files on my personal system, figuring that if Jessica ever changed her mind about redundancy planning, I would be ready. The family dynamics made everything more complicated. David genuinely loved his wife, but he was caught between supporting her leadership decisions and maintaining his relationship with me. Our parents, who had built their own small business from nothing, couldn't understand why there was tension between their daughter and daughter-in-law. They kept suggesting we work things out for the family's sake, not realizing that business conflicts and personal relationships don't always resolve neatly. Tonight's public termination was the culmination of months of professional dismissal and personal condescension. Jessica had finally found the excuse she needed to remove what she saw as David's incompetent sister from her company. The irony was that those training courses she mocked had prepared me for exactly this kind of scenario. My phone started ringing before I even reached my apartment building. The first call was from our night security guard at the main distribution center. Mary, thank God you answered. There's been a fire. I pulled over to the side of the road, my calm facade finally cracking. What kind of fire, Tommy? How bad is it? Bad, real bad. Started in the electrical room around 9:30. Fire department just got it under control, but the whole East warehouse is gone. All the automotive components, most of the medical device inventory. The stuff for the Johnson Industries order that ships Monday gone. My stomach dropped. The Johnson Industries order was worth $2.7 million, with penalty clauses for late delivery that could bankrupt a company Morrison's size. But that was just the beginning. If the automotive components were destroyed, 3 other major clients would face production shutdowns by Wednesday. Tommy, I need you to do something for me. Take pictures of everything, especially the electrical room. Document whatever the fire inspector says about the cause. And Tommy, don't let anyone else know you talked to me tonight. This is important. After I hung up, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching my breath fog the windows as the reality sank in. The fire had started in the electrical room I had been begging Jessica to upgrade for 8 months. The outdated wiring and overloaded circuits were documented in report after report that she had filed away without reading. The backup generators I had recommended were never installed. The fire suppression system I had researched was deemed unnecessary expense. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Jessica told me what happened at dinner. Can we talk tomorrow? This is complicated. I typed back, more complicated than you know. Check the news tonight. Then I turned off my phone and drove home, already formulating the plan that would either save Morrison Industrial Supply or destroy it completely. Jessica had 15 minutes from the moment I walked out of that Thanksgiving dinner before her real job as CEO would begin. She just didn't know it yet. By 6 a.m. on Friday morning, my phone had 37 missed calls and 62 text messages. I made coffee and reviewed them systematically while the local news played Morrison's distribution center fire as their lead story. The reporters stood in front of the charred remains of what used to be our most profitable warehouse, describing millions of dollars in damage and raising questions about industrial safety standards. The missed calls told the real story. 15 were from Jessica, starting panicked around 11 p.m. and becoming increasingly frantic through the night. 10 were from our biggest clients, demanding immediate updates on their order status. 12 were from vendors who had seen the news and were calling to assess their exposure. The messages from David were the most heartbreaking. Mary, please call back. Jessica is falling apart. We need your help. But I wasn't ready to help yet. First, I needed to understand exactly what Jessica was telling people about my sudden departure. I called Patricia Williams, my mentor, and a veteran supply chain executive who knew everyone in our industry. Patricia had taken me under her wing during my first logistics conference 2 years ago, recognizing something in me that reminded her of her younger self. She was the reason I had pursued those advanced certifications, and her recommendation had opened doors with suppliers across 3 states. Mary, I was just going to call you. I heard about the Morrison fire, and then I started getting some very strange phone calls about you. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. What kind of phone calls? Honey, someone is spreading rumors that you were terminated for embezzlement. 3 different vendors called me yesterday, asking if I knew anything about financial irregularities in your department. I told them it was impossible, but the story is making the rounds pretty quickly. The mug slipped from my hand, shattering against my kitchen floor. Jessica wasn't just trying to cover her mistake in firing me. She was actively destroying my professional reputation to justify her decision. Patricia, I need you to know the truth. I was fired at Thanksgiving dinner because Jessica claimed I was wasting company money on training courses. The same courses you recommended. There was no embezzlement, no financial irregularities, nothing. She fired me in front of my entire family as some kind of power play. Patricia's silence stretched for several seconds. Mary, if that's true, then whoever is spreading the embezzlement story is committing serious defamation. But more importantly for Morrison, if they just fired their only qualified supply chain manager 12 hours before a major crisis, they're in deeper trouble than they know. That's when Patricia explained what I hadn't fully grasped yet. The automotive components destroyed in the fire weren't just inventory sitting in a warehouse. They were specialized parts with lead times of 6 to 8 weeks, supplied by vendors who required personal relationships and detailed technical knowledge to navigate their ordering systems. The medical device components were even more complex, requiring FDA documentation and chain of custody protocols that I had spent months learning to manage properly. Jessica probably thinks she can just call these companies and reorder everything for rush delivery, Patricia continued. She has no idea that most of these relationships are built on years of trust and technical expertise. Without you, Morrison doesn't just lose inventory, they lose their ability to replace it quickly. As Patricia and I talked, my other line kept ringing. I was letting all the calls go to voicemail, but I could see they were coming from our vendor partners. Companies like Hartwell Manufacturing, whose automotive division had worked exclusively with me for the past 18 months. Precision Medical Supply, where I had cultivated a friendship with purchasing manager Carol Henderson that had resulted in priority treatment during industry shortages. Midwest Components, whose owner Jim Bradley had told me just last month that I was the best account manager his company had worked with in 15 years. After I hung up with Patricia, I listened to the voicemails. They were exactly what I expected and exactly what I dreaded. Vendors who had heard rumors about my termination and wanted to understand what had happened. Suppliers expressing concern about the fire and asking for reassurance about account stability. Most heartbreaking were the messages from partners who had heard the embezzlement rumors and were calling to express shock and disbelief. Jim Bradley's message was the longest. "Mary, I just got off the phone with someone from Morrison who told me you were no longer with the company due to some kind of financial issue. I told them that was impossible, that you were the most ethical person I'd worked with in 23 years in this business. But they insisted it was true. I need to hear from you directly what's going on, because if these allegations are real, we're going to have to freeze your account and demand immediate payment on outstanding balances. I don't want to do that, but my board won't give me a choice. Please call me back." That's when I realized Jessica's strategy. By spreading embezzlement rumors, she was forcing vendors to distance themselves from Morrison, immediately creating the very crisis that would justify my termination. If the vendors cut off relationships and demanded immediate payment, Morrison would face cash flow problems on top of the inventory crisis. Jessica could then blame the company's collapse on my alleged criminal activity and the vendors' unreasonable responses to my supposed crimes. It was diabolical in its simplicity and devastating in its potential consequences. I spent the rest of Friday morning documenting everything. Screenshots of text messages, printed copies of emails, recorded phone calls with vendors who were willing to share what Morrison's management had told them. By lunchtime, I had a clear picture of Jessica's narrative. I had been stealing money through fake training courses and vendor kickbacks. I had been terminated when the scheme was discovered, and the fire was either coincidental bad timing or possibly sabotage on my part. David called just before noon. I finally answered. "Mary, where are you?" "Jessica has been trying to reach you all morning. We need your vendor contact list and password access to the supply chain management system. The insurance adjuster wants to start processing claims, and our clients are demanding delivery schedules we can't provide without replacement orders." "David, what exactly did Jessica tell you about why she fired me?" "She said you were spending unauthorized money on courses that weren't job-related, and when she confronted you about it, you became hostile and stormed out. She said she had to terminate you for insubordination and fiscal irresponsibility." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And what did she tell the vendors about why I'm gone?" David's pause told me he was starting to understand. "Mary, what did she tell the vendors?" "She told them I was fired for embezzlement, David. She's been calling our suppliers since last night claiming I stole money and suggesting the fire might have been sabotage. 3 vendors have already frozen our accounts and are demanding immediate payment on outstanding balances." David's phone hit something hard. I heard him swearing in the background before he came back on the line. "Mary, please tell me you're lying." "I'm not lying." And David, "Those training courses she mocked. They're the reason I know exactly how to fix this crisis, and exactly how badly Jessica has made it worse. She has 15 minutes to start dealing with the consequences of what she's done, or this company will be in bankruptcy proceedings by next Friday." The line went quiet for a long time. "What do you need me to do?" David finally asked. First, you need to understand that Jessica just destroyed 3 years of vendor relationship building with a single night of phone calls. Second, you need to decide whether you're married to your wife or committed to saving the family business, because right now you can't do both. That's when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Carol Henderson from Precision Medical Supply standing on my front porch, holding a manila folder and looking determined. I opened the door to face the first vendor willing to hear my side of the story directly. Carol Henderson had driven 2 hours from Cincinnati to stand on my doorstep, and the expression on her face told me she hadn't come to deliver good news. I invited her in, offering coffee she politely declined, while settling into my living room chair with the deliberate manner of someone preparing for an uncomfortable conversation. Mary, I've been working in medical device procurement for 16 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened yesterday. She began opening her manila folder to reveal printed emails and official letterhead documents. At 7 this morning, Morrison's acting CEO sent our compliance department an official notice stating that you had been terminated for financial misconduct and that all previous agreements negotiated under your authority were subject to immediate review. The words hit me like cold water. Jessica sent that in writing, on company letterhead with legal CCs to our risk management team and corporate counsel. Mary, when procurement departments receive notices like this, we have to assume the worst. It suggests possible contract irregularities, potential fraud in our approval processes, maybe even compromised documentation in FDA submissions. Our legal team is recommending we suspend all Morrison orders pending a complete audit of every transaction you handled over the past 3 years. Carol leaned forward, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. But I've been working with you for 18 months, Mary. I've watched you catch billing errors that saved both our companies money. I've seen you stay late to coordinate emergency shipments that kept production lines running. The idea that you were stealing money is so ridiculous that I decided to drive here and ask you directly what's really happening. I showed Carol everything. The performance reviews documenting my cost savings and efficiency improvements. The approved training course receipts with Jessica's own signature on the reimbursement forms. The risk assessment reports I had submitted about vendor dependencies, all of which carried timestamps showing they were completed months before the fire. Most importantly, I showed her the detailed backup supplier network I had been building, specifically designed to handle exactly the kind of crisis Morrison was now facing. So you weren't embezzling money, Carol said after reviewing the documents. You were preparing for emergencies that your boss refused to acknowledge might happen. That's exactly right, and Carol, those emergency suppliers I've been cultivating. 3 of them could have Morrison's medical device orders fulfilled and shipped by Wednesday if they get authorization by Monday morning. But only if someone who understands the technical specifications and regulatory requirements coordinates the orders. Carol closed her folder and looked directly at me. Mary, if you can guarantee Wednesday delivery on the medical devices, Precision will reverse our account freeze and continue our partnership. But I need a commitment from Morrison's management that you're authorized to handle the transition. After Carol left, promising to hold off on the audit pending resolution of the management situation, I finally returned Jessica's phone calls. She answered on the first ring. Mary. Thank God, where have you been? We need you to come in immediately and provide access to your vendor databases. The insurance company needs documentation for the claims, and our clients are threatening contract cancellations. Jessica, I need you to explain something to me. Why did you tell Precision Medical that I was terminated for financial misconduct? The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Mary, I don't know what you're talking about. I told them you were no longer with the company due to policy violations. If they interpreted that differently, that's their problem. Policy violations like embezzlement. Mary, you're being paranoid. Look, we can discuss the circumstances of your termination later. Right now, Morrison needs your help to get through this crisis. Can you please just focus on what's important? It was the same dismissive tone she had used during every previous conversation about supply chain vulnerabilities. The same refusal to acknowledge that her decisions had consequences. The same expectation that other people would clean up problems she had created. Jessica let me be very clear about what's important. Morrison lost $4.2 million in inventory last night because of electrical systems. I begged you to upgrade. You responded to that crisis by destroying our vendor relationships with false accusations about my integrity. 3 major suppliers have frozen our accounts. 2 others are demanding immediate payment on balances, and our biggest clients are preparing to invoke penalty clauses that could bankrupt the company. That's what's important. Mary, you're overreacting. These vendor issues are temporary. Once I explain the situation properly, they'll understand. What situation, Jessica? That you fired your supply chain manager for being too good at her job. That you ignored safety warnings that could have prevented the fire. That you lied to our partners about why I was terminated. Jessica's voice turned cold. Mary, I'm offering you an opportunity to help your family's business recover from a natural disaster. If you're going to be petty about employment disputes, then maybe you really weren't the right fit for Morrison after all. I hung up before saying something I would regret. The weekend became a blur of phone calls, research, and difficult decisions. Saturday morning brought news that Morrison's board of directors had called an emergency meeting for Monday to address the crisis. Jessica had apparently told them that vendor relationship problems were the result of my unprofessional behavior following my termination, and that she needed board authority to bring in outside consultants to rebuild supplier partnerships. Saturday afternoon brought a call from Patricia Williams with information that changed everything. Mary, I've been asking around about Jessica's background, and you need to hear this. Before she married your brother and joined Morrison, she worked for Hartwell Manufacturing for 6 months. She was terminated for billing personal expenses to corporate training accounts. The irony was staggering. Jessica had accused me of exactly the same financial misconduct that had cost her a previous job. There's more, Patricia continued. I talked to someone who worked with her at Hartwell. She was billing personal shopping trips as client entertainment spa visits, as stress management training, even her wedding planning consultation as leadership development. When they caught her, she claimed it was all approved by her supervisor and tried to blame the accounting department for processing unauthorized expenses. Sunday evening brought the call that forced my hand. David phoned from Morrison's offices, where he was working with Jessica to prepare for Monday's board meeting. Mary, I just watched my wife spend 4 hours trying to contact our suppliers, and it's not going well. Hartwell Manufacturing won't even take her calls. Precision Medical wants written guarantees about contract performance that she can't provide. Midwest Components told her they're moving all their business to our competitors, unless Morrison provides references and credit guarantees we don't have. David's voice cracked slightly. Mary, I think Jessica might be in over her head here. She keeps saying everything will work out once the vendors calm down and start thinking rationally. But from what I'm seeing, it looks like she might have made this situation worse by trying to handle it herself. David, Jessica didn't make this situation worse by accident. She made it worse by lying to our vendors about why I was fired. She told them I was embezzling money, which triggered compliance reviews and account freezes that wouldn't have happened if she had simply said I was terminated for policy disagreements. Why would she lie about that? Because she needed our vendor problems to be my fault instead of hers. If the vendors cut us off because they think I'm a criminal, then Morrison's collapse can be blamed on my alleged crimes instead of her decision to fire the one person who could have prevented this crisis. David was quiet for a long time before responding. Mary, what would it take to fix this? It would take Jessica publicly admitting that she lied about my termination and providing written clarification to every vendor she contacted. It would take her acknowledging that the fire resulted from safety issues she chose to ignore. It would take her stepping aside and letting someone who understands supply chain management handle the vendor relationships. And David, it would take you deciding whether you want to save your marriage or save your company, because you probably can't do both. Monday morning, I received 2 phone calls that crystallized my choice. The first was from Morrison's biggest competitor offering me a position as their director of vendor relations with a salary 40% higher than what Morrison had been paying me. They had heard about my situation through industry contacts and wanted to hire me specifically to bring my vendor relationships to their company. The second call was from Tommy the security guard, with news that the insurance company's investigation had confirmed the fire started from exactly the electrical problems I had been warning about for months. I had a choice to make. I could take the competitor's offer and watch Morrison collapse under the weight of Jessica's mismanagement. I could walk away entirely and let my brother's company fail while building a new career elsewhere. Or I could go back to Morrison and fix everything, knowing that doing so would require destroying Jessica's credibility completely. The decision became clear when I realized that accepting the competitor's offer wouldn't just hurt Jessica, it would hurt David, destroy the jobs of 43 innocent employees, and eliminate the supplier relationships I had spent 3 years building. Those relationships weren't just professional connections, they were partnerships built on trust, mutual respect, and shared commitment to excellence. Using them to damage Morrison would violate everything those relationships represented. At 3:30 Monday afternoon, I walked into Morrison's offices for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner. Jessica was in the conference room with 2 board members, a lawyer, and someone who appeared to be a consultant. Through the glass doors, I could see charts and graphs depicting Morrison's deteriorating position. I knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. Jessica, I have 5 minutes of information that will change everything. The question is whether you want the board to hear it now or after your bankruptcy filing. Jessica's face went white when she saw me standing in the conference room doorway, but she recovered quickly, adopting the same dismissive tone she had perfected over 3 years of professional interactions. Mary, this is a closed board meeting. If you want to discuss employment matters, you can contact our Human Resources Department and schedule an appropriate time. The board members looked confused. The consultant, a sharp-dressed woman with an expensive briefcase, studied me with obvious curiosity. The lawyer, someone I didn't recognize, started taking notes immediately. I'm not here about employment matters, Jessica. I'm here about criminal fraud, vendor contract violations, and securities misrepresentation. The question is whether you want to hear my evidence before or after I deliver it to the district attorney's office. I had spent Sunday night preparing a presentation that would have impressed my most demanding business school professors. 3 hours of research, document compilation, and strategic analysis had produced a 30-page report that detailed exactly what Jessica had been doing and exactly how much trouble Morrison was really in. I placed copies in front of each board member and opened my laptop to the first slide. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past 4 days, Morrison's acting CEO has told our vendors that I was terminated for embezzlement. She's told employees that I sabotaged company systems before leaving. She's told insurance investigators that maintenance issues were outside management control. All of these statements are false, and I have documentation proving they constitute fraud, defamation, and obstruction of insurance claims. The first section of my presentation covered Jessica's own financial irregularities. Using my administrative access to Morrison's accounting system, which Jessica had forgotten to revoke, I had discovered 8 months of suspicious expense reports, personal purchases charged to training budgets, spa visits billed as stress management consultations, shopping trips categorized as client entertainment, even her car payments disguised as transportation allowances for business development. This pattern of expense fraud totals $47,312 over 8 months. I continued clicking to the next slide showing highlighted expense reports and credit card statements. Ironically, this is substantially more than Jessica claimed I was stealing through legitimate professional development courses. Board member Harold Morrison, Jessica's father-in-law and company founder, was studying the documents with an expression of growing horror. Jessica, are these allegations accurate? Jessica started to respond, but I held up my hand. There's more, Harold, much more. The second section detailed Jessica's kickback arrangement with our primary electrical contractor. For the past year, she had been approving maintenance invoices without proper review, allowing the contractor to overcharge for work that was never completed. In exchange, the contractor had been providing Jessica with personal services. New lighting for her home office, electrical work for her kitchen renovation, even landscape lighting for her backyard, all charged to Morrison's facilities maintenance budget. The electrical room that caused Thursday's fire was scheduled for upgrades 6 times in the past 8 months. I explained, showing the maintenance requests I had submitted and Jessica's responses. Each time Jessica approved payment to the contractor for materials and labor that were never provided. The outdated wiring and overloaded circuits that started the fire were exactly the problems these maintenance contracts were supposed to address. The lawyer was writing frantically. The consultant had stopped taking notes and was staring at Jessica with unconcealed amazement. "Mary, these are serious allegations," Harold said carefully. "Do you have corroborating evidence?" "I have the contractor's invoices, photographs of the work that was supposedly completed, and timeline documentation showing that Jessica personally approved payments for electrical upgrades that never happened. I also have recordings of phone conversations where the contractor admits to providing personal services in lieu of completing Morrison's work orders." Jessica finally found her voice. "Mary, you're obviously fabricating this information as revenge for your termination. Everyone in this room knows you're bitter about losing your job, and now you're making desperate attempts to blame me for your own professional failures." I clicked to the next slide, which showed Jessica's email correspondence with Morrison's largest competitor, Davidson Industries. "That's interesting, Jessica, because these emails suggest that you've been negotiating to sell Morrison to Davidson Industries for 18 months, specifically planning to blame any operational problems on management incompetence that justified a below-market purchase price." The room became completely silent. The email chain I had discovered was devastating in its clarity. Jessica had been providing Davidson with confidential information about Morrison's vulnerabilities, including detailed financial projections showing how vendor dependency problems could be manufactured to justify emergency sale conditions. She had even suggested that firing key personnel at strategic moments could accelerate the company's decline and make acquisition more attractive. According to this correspondence, I continued reading directly from her emails. Jessica planned to create operational crisis that demonstrates current management inadequacy and eliminate personnel whose institutional knowledge might complicate transition. Thursday's fire and my termination weren't separate events. They were coordinated elements of a plan to force Morrison into distressed sale conditions. Harold Morrison stood up slowly, his face expressing the kind of cold fury that comes from realizing you've been betrayed by family. "Jessica is Mary reading your actual correspondence. Daddy Harold, I can explain everything. You have to understand the company was already in trouble. I was just trying to explore options that might preserve some value for the family. By selling my life's work to our biggest competitor at a fraction of its value, by lying to our vendors about criminal activity, by stealing money from the company budget to pay for your personal expenses." The consultant cleared her throat. "And if I may interrupt these revelations, substantially change our strategic options. Mrs. Morrison, were you planning to disclose your negotiations with Davidson Industries to the board?" Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under. David expects me to be this perfect CEO, but I never wanted this responsibility. The company was already failing, and I was just trying to find a way out that didn't destroy everyone's future." "By committing fraud?" Harold asked quietly. "By being realistic about our situation. Morrison can't compete with companies like Davidson long-term. I was trying to arrange a transition that preserved jobs and provided fair compensation for shareholders." I clicked to the final slide of my presentation. "Jessica, you're right that Morrison faces competitive challenges, but those challenges are manageable with proper supply chain management, vendor relationship maintenance, and operational efficiency improvements. Unfortunately, your approach to creating acquisition conditions has destroyed the very assets that make Morrison valuable to potential buyers." The last section of my presentation outlined the vendor relationship damage Jessica had caused and the financial consequences of her mismanagement. Account freezes that would delay production by weeks. Compliance reviews that could result in regulatory sanctions. Credit holds that would force immediate payment on terms that could drain Morrison's cash reserves. However, I continued, these problems are reversible if addressed immediately with proper vendor relations expertise and transparent communication about management changes. Harold looked directly at me. "Mary, what would it take to restore Morrison's vendor relationships?" "It would require Jessica's immediate resignation and public acknowledgement that her statements about my termination were false. It would require full restitution of fraudulent expenses and cooperation with insurance investigators. Most importantly, it would require new management committed to transparent ethical business practices and long-term vendor partnership development. Jessica stood up abruptly. I'm not resigning anything. This is my company, and I won't be forced out by fabricated accusations and personal vendettas. Actually, Jessica, Harold said quietly, this is my company, and based on what I've just learned, you're not just resigning. You're being terminated for cause effective immediately. As if scripted, the conference room door opened to reveal 2 police officers and a detective who introduced himself as Lieutenant Coleman from the Economic Crimes Unit. We received some very interesting documentation this morning regarding possible securities fraud and contractor kickback schemes, he said, looking directly at Jessica. We'd like to ask you some questions about your financial arrangements with Morrison Industries and Davidson Corporation. Jessica's final attempt at control was trying to delete Morrison's vendor contact database from her laptop. She didn't realize that I had predicted exactly this move and created multiple backup systems across different servers. Her desperate mouse clicking achieved nothing except providing additional evidence of obstruction attempts. Within 5 minutes, Jessica was being escorted from the building by security while Lieutenant Coleman explained her rights regarding financial fraud investigations. I was alone in the conference room with Harold David, and the sudden realization that I had just saved Morrison Industries by destroying my brother's marriage. David looked like someone had explained that everything he thought he knew about his life was wrong. He stood at the conference room window, watching police cars pull away from Morrison's parking lot, with his wife in the back seat of one of them. Harold was on the phone with the company's insurance attorney, discussing the implications of Jessica's fraud for their fire damage claims. The consultant had packed her materials and left explaining that her crisis management services were no longer needed given the dramatic shift in circumstances. I was updating my vendor contact spreadsheet, preparing to make the most important series of phone calls in Morrison's corporate history. Mary, David said without turning from the window. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Okay. How long have you known about Jessica's financial problems? I looked up from my laptop. I suspected something was wrong when she started criticizing my legitimate training expenses while approving questionable maintenance contracts. But I didn't have proof until this weekend when I used my administrative access to review expense reports and email archives. Could you have exposed this earlier? Probably. But David, I didn't go looking for evidence to hurt Jessica. I went looking for evidence to save Morrison after she tried to destroy my reputation. If she had handled Thursday's crisis honestly, I would never have investigated her background. David finally turned to face me. So I'm responsible for this mess because I married someone who was stealing from my family's company. David, you're responsible for making decisions about who to trust with business operations, but you're not responsible for Jessica's choice to commit fraud. That's on her. Harold finished his phone call and rejoined our conversation. Mary, I owe you an apology, a significant apology. I allowed family relationships to override business judgment, and that nearly destroyed everything I spent 40 years building. Harold, the important thing is that it's not destroyed yet. But we have approximately 6 hours to restore vendor confidence before Morrison's biggest clients start making permanent alternative arrangements. I opened my laptop to a prepared spreadsheet showing Morrison's critical supplier relationships and the specific steps needed to restore each partnership. Jim Bradley at Midwest Components will restore our account if he receives written acknowledgement that my termination was based on false information. Carol Henderson at Precision Medical will resume shipments if she gets confirmation that new management is committed to regulatory compliance. Tom Chen at Hartwell Manufacturing wants reassurance that Morrison has adequate cash flow to honor payment terms under crisis conditions. Harold studied my vendor recovery plan. Mary, this is remarkably comprehensive for something you prepared over a weekend. Harold, I've been preparing for supply chain crisis management since my first week at Morrison. The only surprise is that the crisis came from internal fraud instead of external market disruption. I started making calls. Jim Bradley answered on the second ring. Mary, I was hoping I'd hear from you. Things have been crazy since Thursday. Jim. I'm calling to let you know that Morrison's management situation has changed dramatically since our last conversation. Jessica Morrison has been terminated for financial misconduct, and I've been asked to resume vendor relations responsibilities immediately. Mary, are you telling me that the embezzlement accusations were false? I'm telling you that Jessica has been arrested for defrauding Morrison Industries, and that her statements about my financial conduct were part of a pattern of fraudulent representation designed to cover her own criminal activity. Jim was quiet for several seconds. Mary, if that's true, then Midwest wants to restore full account privileges immediately. We've been sick about cutting you off based on what we thought was reliable information from your management team. Jim, I'm going to email you official documentation of Jessica's termination and my reappointment to vendor relations. Can Midwest expedite replacement orders for Morrison's automotive components lost in Thursday's fire? Mary, we can have replacement inventory shipped by Wednesday morning if we receive purchase orders by tomorrow at noon. And Mary, I'm sorry we doubted your integrity. We should have known better. The call with Carol Henderson at Precision Medical went even better. She had already heard through industry networks that Jessica had been arrested, and Precision's legal team was prepared to restore Morrison's account status immediately upon receiving proper documentation. Mary, our production team can have your medical device orders ready for Thursday delivery if we get authorization tomorrow. We held manufacturing capacity for Morrison because we didn't believe the allegations against you were credible. Tom Chen at Hartwell Manufacturing was the most challenging conversation, partly because his company had previous negative history with Jessica from her short employment there years earlier. Latin. Mary, when I heard that Jessica Morrison was making accusations about financial misconduct, my first thought was projection. Criminals often accuse others of the crimes they're committing themselves. I'm glad to hear that Morrison's board discovered her fraud before it caused permanent damage. By 5:30 that evening, I had restored relationships with 11 critical vendors, arranged emergency replacement orders for 87% of the inventory lost in the fire, and established expedited delivery schedules that would minimize client disruption. The total cost for emergency procurement was only 12% higher than standard pricing compared to the 400% premium Davidson Industries had quoted for emergency supply services. Harold was reviewing my vendor restoration report when David returned from the police station where he had been providing background information about Jessica's access to company financial systems. Mary, this is incredible work, Harold said. In 5 hours, you've accomplished more vendor relations progress than most supply chain managers could achieve in 5 weeks. Harold, these relationships weren't built in 5 hours. They were built over 3 years of consistent, honest professional interaction. What I accomplished today was reminding our vendors that Morrison's core values haven't changed just because we had a management problem. David sat down heavily in the conference room chair Jessica had occupied that morning. Mary, I need you to know that I never had any idea what Jessica was doing. The expense reports, the contractor arrangements, the negotiations with Davidson. I trusted her to handle CEO responsibilities while I focused on production operations. David, I know you didn't know. But going forward, Morrison needs management oversight systems that prevent any single person from having unchecked authority over financial decisions or vendor relationships. Harold nodded. Mary, I'd like to offer you the position of Vice President of Operations with responsibility for vendor relations, supply chain management, and procurement oversight. The salary would be 60% higher than your previous position with equity participation and full authority to implement the risk management protocols you've been recommending. I looked at David before responding. Harold, I appreciate the offer, but I need to know that David supports having me in a senior management role. This company needs family unity, not ongoing tension about business decisions. David managed a tired smile. Mary, after watching you save Morrison in a single afternoon, I think you're probably the most qualified person in the family to make business decisions. I'd like you to accept Harold's offer. I accepted with 2 conditions. First, Morrison would implement transparent financial oversight systems that required multiple approvals for any expenses over $5,000. Second, the company would invest in comprehensive crisis management infrastructure, including backup vendor networks, redundant supply chains, and disaster recovery protocols. As we finished our planning session, Lieutenant Coleman called with an update on Jessica's arrest. She had been charged with fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. More importantly, her cooperation with the investigation was providing evidence about Davidson Industries' involvement in industrial espionage and attempted manipulation of acquisition conditions. "Mr. Morrison," Lieutenant Coleman told Harold, "your daughter-in-law's case is expanding into a broader investigation of anti-competitive practices in your industry. We'll need Morrison's cooperation, but it looks like several companies may have been targeted for similar acquisition manipulation schemes." Walking to my car that evening, I realized that my cryptic warning to Jessica at Thanksgiving dinner had been more accurate than I had anticipated. She really did have 15 minutes before her main job became apparent. I just hadn't expected that her main job would turn out to be federal defendant in a corporate fraud investigation. The transformation at Morrison Industries over the following weeks was remarkable to witness. Within 72 hours of Jessica's arrest, our vendor relationships had not only recovered, but actually strengthened. Companies that had been hesitant to work with Morrison under Jessica's management were now eager to establish partnerships with what they perceived as a more ethical, professionally managed organization. The emergency supply orders I had coordinated arrived exactly on schedule. By the following Tuesday, less than a week after the fire, Morrison was fulfilling client orders with minimal delivery delays. Our insurance company expedited their claim processing after investigators confirmed that Jessica's maintenance fraud had directly contributed to the fire's cause and severity. The industry response to our crisis management was overwhelmingly positive. Patricia Williams called to tell me that Morrison's vendor recovery was being discussed as a case study in supply chain resilience at the next Logistics Management Conference. "Mary, what you accomplished last week is exactly the kind of crisis leadership that separates exceptional supply chain managers from average ones," she said. "You turned a potential bankruptcy situation into a demonstration of professional excellence." But the personal costs of the situation were still being calculated. David moved into a temporary apartment while divorce proceedings began. Jessica's criminal defense attorney was negotiating plea agreements that would require full restitution and cooperation with federal investigators. The fraud investigation had expanded to include Davidson Industries, whose systematic targeting of acquisition candidates through planted personnel was apparently much more extensive than Jessica's case alone. Harold was struggling with the knowledge that his family's business had come within days of destruction due to his failure to implement proper oversight systems. "Mary Catal," he told me during one of our weekly management meetings, "I spent 40 years building this company by trusting people to do the right thing. I never imagined I needed to protect Morrison from family members who would steal from us." Harold, trust is still the foundation of good business relationships. But trust needs to be supported by verification systems and transparent accountability measures. What we're implementing now isn't about suspicion. It's about creating structures that protect honest people from being accused of dishonest behavior. The new oversight systems were working well. Every expense report required dual approval and supporting documentation. Vendor contracts needed review by both operations and finance departments. Major procurement decisions were made by committee rather than individual authority. Most importantly, we had established multiple redundant systems for critical business functions, ensuring that no single person's absence or misconduct could jeopardize Morrison's operations. 3 months after the crisis, Morrison received industry recognition for supply chain innovation from the American Logistics Association. The award specifically cited our rapid recovery from operational disruption and our development of vendor relationship protocols that could serve as models for other mid-sized manufacturing companies. Patricia Williams presented the award at the annual conference, where I was invited to speak about crisis management and vendor relationship development. My presentation, titled "Building Trust Networks That Withstand Crisis," was attended by over 300 supply chain professionals and resulted in consulting requests from 6 different companies. The most satisfying moment came during my speech when I was able to thank the vendors who had supported Morrison during our crisis period. Jim Bradley, Carol Henderson, and Tom Chen were all in the audience, and their willingness to restore relationships based on professional trust rather than corporate reputation had been crucial to our recovery. Effective vendor relationships aren't built on contracts or purchase volumes, I told the conference audience. They're built on consistent, honest communication and mutual respect for professional expertise. When crisis occurs, those relationships become the difference between recovery and collapse. The Davidson Industries investigation concluded with federal charges against 3 executives for industrial espionage fraud and anti-competitive practices. Jessica's cooperation with prosecutors resulted in a plea agreement requiring 18 months supervised probation, full restitution of stolen funds, and permanent prohibition from corporate officer positions. David handled the divorce proceedings with dignity, ensuring that Jessica received fair treatment despite her criminal conduct. "Mary, he told me after the settlement was finalized. "I married Jessica because I thought she was ambitious and business-minded. I didn't realize there's a difference between ambition and greed." 6 months after the crisis, Morrison Industries was thriving beyond our most optimistic projections. Revenue had increased by 27% due to improved vendor relationships and operational efficiency. Our client retention rate was 94% compared to industry averages of 78%. Most importantly, our reputation for ethical business practices and crisis management competency was generating new partnership opportunities across multiple industries. Harold officially retired, transferring ownership to David and offering me equity partnership as Chief Operating Officer. "Mary," he said during the transition ceremony, "you didn't just save Morrison Industries, you showed us what integrity looks like under pressure and what professional excellence can accomplish when supported by proper systems." The final vindication came when Hartwell Manufacturing offered me a position as Director of National Supply Chain Operations with a salary more than double what Morrison could provide. I turned down the offer, choosing to continue building Morrison's success rather than leaving for individual advancement. "Why did you stay?" Patricia Williams asked me during lunch the following week. "Because success isn't just about personal achievement," I replied. "It's about building something valuable with people you respect. Morrison isn't just a company now. It's proof that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, creates opportunities that are more satisfying than anything you could achieve through shortcuts or compromises." The new Thanksgiving dinner at David's house was smaller, but infinitely more peaceful. My nephew asked me to explain what had happened with Jessica in terms a 12-year-old could understand. "Sometimes people make bad choices because they want success without earning it," I told him. "Your Aunt Jessica tried to take shortcuts that hurt other people, and eventually those shortcuts caught up with her. The important lesson is that real success comes from being good at what you do and treating people honestly even when nobody is watching." Gah. David raised his wine glass in a toast. "To Mary, who showed us that family means protecting each other by telling the truth, not protecting each other from the truth." It was the best Thanksgiving dinner of my life. 1 year later, I stood in the same conference room where I had confronted Jessica's fraud, but this time I was presenting Morrison Industries' annual performance report to a room full of potential investors. We weren't seeking acquisition offers. We were evaluating partnership opportunities from companies that wanted to learn from our crisis management expertise and vendor relationship strategies. The numbers were remarkable by any standard. Morrison had achieved 34% revenue growth, expanded into 3 new market sectors, and maintained vendor relationship satisfaction scores above 90% across all categories. Our employee retention rate was 97%, and we had been recognized by the Better Business Bureau for ethical business practices. More importantly, Morrison had become something rare in modern business, a mid-sized company that competed on expertise and integrity rather than price-cutting and cost avoidance. Our clients paid premium prices for our services because they valued the reliability, innovation, and professional excellence we delivered consistently. David had grown into an exceptional CEO, combining operational expertise with the kind of ethical leadership that creates long-term value rather than short-term profits. Harold remained involved as chairman emeritus, providing wisdom and continuity while allowing younger leadership to drive innovation and growth. The vendor relationships that had saved Morrison during our crisis had evolved into genuine partnerships that benefited all parties. Jim Bradley's company had become our exclusive automotive components supplier, with Morrison providing supply chain consulting services in exchange for priority pricing and inventory access. Carol Henderson had been promoted to regional director at Precision Medical, partly based on the successful partnership model she had developed with Morrison. Mary Ahai, Harold told me after the investor presentation. When I founded Morrison 41 years ago, I hoped to build a company that would create good jobs and serve clients honestly. I never imagined we would become an industry leader in crisis management and ethical business practices. Harold, crisis management isn't really about handling emergencies, I replied. It's about building systems and relationships that can withstand pressure. Everything we've accomplished came from decisions to do things right from the beginning, rather than trying to fix problems after they develop. The personal satisfaction of Morrison's success was accompanied by broader industry recognition that validated my approach to supply chain management. I had been elected to the board of the American Logistics Association, invited to serve on advisory committees for 3 universities, and asked to write articles for professional journals about vendor relationship development and crisis preparedness. Most rewarding were the mentorship requests from young professionals who wanted guidance about building ethical, sustainable careers in supply chain management. I had established a scholarship program at my alma mater for students pursuing logistics and operations management degrees, specifically supporting candidates who demonstrated commitment to professional ethics and relationship-building approaches to business development. The most important thing I can teach you, I told scholarship recipients during our annual meeting, is that shortcuts don't actually save time. They just create bigger problems that take longer to solve. Whether you're managing vendor relationships, handling financial responsibilities, or dealing with family conflicts, the approach that feels slower at first almost always produces better results in the end. Jessica's story had become a cautionary tale in our industry about the costs of unethical behavior and the importance of proper oversight systems. She had completed her probation requirements and was working as a sales associate at a retail store, barred permanently from corporate leadership positions. David had remarried this time to someone who shared his values about family loyalty and professional integrity. The fire that had destroyed Morrison's warehouse had been completely rebuilt with state-of-the-art safety systems, backup power infrastructure, and redundant inventory management protocols. We gave tours to other companies interested in implementing similar risk management approaches, sharing our crisis experience to help others avoid similar vulnerabilities. On the 2nd anniversary of the crisis, Patricia Williams called to congratulate me on Morrison's continued success and to share some industry perspective on what we had accomplished. Mary, when I first heard about Morrison's vendor relationship crisis, I thought you were facing an impossible situation. Most companies never recover from the kind of reputation damage Jessica created. The fact that you not only recovered, but used the crisis as a foundation for building something better is extraordinary. Patricia, the crisis didn't create our success. It revealed capabilities and relationships that were already there but hadn't been tested. Morrison succeeded because we had invested in doing things right before we needed those investments to pay off. That evening, I reflected on everything that had happened since Jessica's dramatic Thanksgiving dinner confrontation. The humiliation of being fired publicly had transformed into opportunities for professional growth that exceeded anything I could have imagined. The destruction of my brother's marriage had ultimately strengthened our family relationships by removing the source of ongoing tension and deception. Most importantly, the crisis had taught me that true strength comes not from seeking revenge when wronged, but from staying committed to your principles and allowing your competence to speak for itself. Jessica's attempt to destroy my reputation had ultimately revealed her own criminal behavior. My focus on solving problems, rather than assigning blame, had created opportunities for building something better than what existed before. The life lesson that emerged from our experience was profound in its simplicity. Integrity isn't just about being honest when it's easy or convenient. It's about maintaining ethical standards when doing so requires personal sacrifice, professional risk, or temporary disadvantage. People who consistently choose integrity over expedience Build reputations and relationships that provide support during difficult times and opportunities during better times. Sometimes the best way to fight back against injustice isn't through direct confrontation or revenge. Sometimes it's through demonstrating that excellence and ethics ultimately produce better results than shortcuts and deception. When you focus on being exceptional at what you do and treating people with honesty and respect, you create a foundation that can withstand any crisis and support any level of success you're willing to work toward. Morrison Industries had become proof that family businesses can thrive when built on professional competence and ethical leadership rather than personal loyalty and emotional compromise. David and I had learned that protecting family relationships sometimes requires confronting family members about behavior that threatens shared values and common goals. The most satisfying aspect of our success was knowing that Morrison's growth had created opportunities for other people. Employees whose jobs were more secure and rewarding, vendors whose businesses had grown through partnership with us clients, whose operations were more efficient because of our services. True success isn't just about individual achievement. It's about creating value that benefits everyone involved in your professional and personal networks. As I finished writing my annual report to Morrison's board of directors, I thought about the young professionals who would face similar challenges in their careers. The business world will always include people who choose shortcuts over competence, deception over honesty, and personal advantage over shared success. But it will also include people who recognize that sustainable success comes from building expertise, maintaining integrity, and treating others with respect and fairness. The choice between these approaches is made every day in small decisions about how to handle problems, how to treat colleagues, and how to respond when faced with pressure to compromise your values. Those daily choices eventually determine whether you build a career that can withstand any crisis or create vulnerabilities that will eventually be exposed under pressure. What unexpected challenges have you faced in your workplace that tested your values and forced you to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Remember to give this story a thumbs up if it resonated with you. Subscribe to stay connected with more real-life workplace stories, and share this with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the power of integrity under pressure. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I hope it encourages you to trust in your own abilities to handle whatever challenges come your way with grace, competence, and unwavering commitment to doing the right thing.